Just so you're aware, this webinar will be recorded and will be archived on the NEALS website for your convenience. You'll notice on your dashboard that all attendees are in listen-only mode and muted during the presentation. There are two ways to connect to audio. If you've selected the mic and speaker setting, please be sure that your mic is activated on your computer. If you'll be calling in using your telephone, select the telephone option on your dashboard and click on the audio box to find your dial-in information. Enter in your access code and your audio PIN. At the end of the presentation, we will have a question and answer period. You will find the questions box on your dashboard and type in your question, and I will read it out loud for you. We will save all questions until the end, but please note that you can type a question in at any point during the presentation. If there are any questions we're unable to get to within the hour, we will follow up through email with responses. So thank you again for joining us today, and welcome to the ALS Association NEALS PALS webinar presentation with Jess Rayborn, co-founder and director of the ALS Treatment Emergency Fund, and Dr. Rick Bedlack from Duke University. Today they will be discussing expanded access. Outside of traditional clinical trials, expanded access is the only legal channel for physicians and their patients to explore unapproved medicine. This webinar will explain the regulations and history of FDA-authorized expanded access and review some common misconceptions on the topic. The presenters will discuss the opportunity for large-scale, centrally coordinated expanded access programs in ALS. So thank you both for speaking today, and with that, Jess, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Perry. I'm very happy to do this presentation with you and Dr. Bedlack. Thank you all for joining us. Today we're really going to focus on a fact-based presentation. It's a topic that's gotten a lot of philosophy and commentary, especially in the last year. But we want to be able to establish some definitions, look at the legal history and best practices of the topic, and then toward the end, talk about some solutions for future improvement of the situation. So Dr. Bedlack and I are going to both speak on this call, and I'll let Dr. Bedlack lead us off right now.
Well, thanks very much, Perry, for that nice introduction, and thank you, Jess. A pleasure to be on this call with you. I'm going to start by giving you a hypothetical case from my clinic, and although I call this a hypothetical case, it's really based on several cases that I've seen over the past 15 years in which the question of expanded access has come up. So this is a 60-year-old university professor, newly diagnosed with clinically definite sporadic ALS. At the time that I'm seeing her, she's very early in the course of her disease, just slightly slurred speech, very mild difficulty swallowing, a little bit more arm and leg weakness, but she's still independent in her activities of daily living, and she can still walk using just a single-pronged cane. She has no obvious problems with her thinking, no obvious behavior problems. After we finish the history and the exam, we sit down, we talk for a while about the ALS diagnosis, and then I present her with stage-appropriate evidence-based management options. And so for someone early in the course of the disease, that would include riluzole and multidisciplinary team care. I also asked her about participating in a research study. Next slide. So she opts for and she gets the first two things I offer her, and she wants to be in a research study. Unfortunately, I can't find one that she qualifies for. So shortly after our visit together, she emails me and asks me if I can help her get something called tirasemtiv. What is tirasemtiv? Well, it's an example of a product that is exciting, but still not FDA approved for anything. It's in development, specifically in development right now for ALS. And as you probably know, if you follow this field, there have been some interesting preliminary results on this particular product. It acts on muscle, and some of the preliminary studies have suggested that this might be able to make some muscles stronger and also might be able to improve breathing in patients with ALS. So she wants me to help her get this. So my questions from this case are, first of all, Jess, are there existing mechanisms that might allow her access to this treatment, a treatment that's still under study? If so, what are these options? What are the specific steps required by each of us to pursue these options? And what should we be thinking about in terms of potential issues and costs for each of these options?
Great. Thanks, Dr. Bedlack, for that excellent case example. I want to use this hour to provide a definitive review of the different kinds of expanded access there is, and through that, I think the answers to this patient's questions will become clearer. As a quick introduction, my professional background is in finance, but I've spent the last 5 years on projects aimed at improving patients' access to medical science. This work has included a commercial drug licensing platform, a few periods of patient advocacy work, and then for the last 3 years, a professional focus on expanded access. Next slide, please. So I want to give a picture of the history and regulatory requirements in this area, and then we'll look at a few of the more common narratives that have been repeated over the years. And from there, we'll look at the remaining barriers from the standpoint of various stakeholders, and then spend a few minutes on a preview of a third-party solution to those barriers. It's ALS Emergency Treatment Fund. And then hopefully after that we'll have 15 minutes or so for answering a couple questions. Okay, next slide. Let's kick this off with a few things that expanded access is not. This topic got a lot of press in 2014, but nearly every story I read had grossly misrepresented what expanded access really is. To those who might lump all early access initiatives together, expanded access programs are not channels for unregulated handout of drugs. Instead, they're managed, tightly regulated exemptions to the Food and Drug Act's prohibition against unapproved drug use. And they require investigational review board as well as physician approval, as well as carefully written informed consent forms. Also, they're not a detour from clinical development of the particular drug. Like anything else, a poorly managed access program could become a headache that drains away resources from other clinical duties, but best practices are to conduct expanded access in ways that complement and support the rapid approval of the study drug. Third, here I show expanded access is already well defined in FDA's regulations, and those regulations leave plenty of room to meet patients' need for treatment options. So in no way should new solutions for sponsoring large expanded access programs be confused with regulatory reform. The regulations are fine. The work to be done is in learning how to use those regulations better. So then I've got some purple here. On the other hand, we saw a lot of activism recently claiming that regulatory channels for expanded access were inadequate, and stories described attempts to win single-patient expanded access where families and physicians struggled to fill out paperwork, had to plead with companies to help them. But that activism seemed to ignore opportunities for group-level expanded access programs. Modern expanded access regulations were designed for programs with many patients at a time, not just for small, exceptional situations. Next slide. So down at the bottom, we've got a basic definition. There's really lots of definitions for expanded access, but this is really widely encompassing, and it's true. We're looking at authorized use of otherwise unapproved therapeutics that are in active clinical development toward marketing approval. Next slide. And some other definitions. Let's go down to the blue box down at the bottom of the page and look at investigational drug. This is a drug that's not approved for any indication, but is under active development right now toward marketing approval in the particular country. We're going to use this in our discussion today. For example, investigational drug is one that might be approved for multiple sclerosis in Japan, but not yet approved for any condition in the United States. This would be still considered an investigational drug once it began development here and requires special FDA authorization before any use. Let's compare this to off-label use, which is different, and that's, let's just say an example, the drug is approved for multiple sclerosis in the United States, but you and your doctor are exploring it in ALS, and there are no special regulatory requirements in this case. The physician can prescribe the medicine without a clinical trial or outside of expanded access programs. So let's go back up to the red box. This is the FDA's definition. The use of investigational drugs and approved drugs where there is a restriction called a REMS, when the primary purpose, and this is important, when the primary purpose is to diagnose, monitor, or treat the disease when there's no satisfactory alternative. So this is strictly a treatment situation. The primary purpose is treatment and care, in contrast with the primary purpose of most clinical trials, which is to learn and to gather evidence. By the way, there's lots of other names and other variations of this in other countries. Managed access or early access in the UK. We have named patient programs in Europe, named patient access in Japan, special access schemes in the Commonwealth countries. So for today, we're going to talk about the opportunity in the United States, although it's true that many programs can and really should include arms in other parts of the world. Next slide. Okay, quickly. Why do we need an expanded access program in the first place? After a really scary history of snake oil and adulterated products, our Congress gave teeth to the newly formed FDA and approved the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938. And this forced companies to back up their claims with evidence and to register food and drug products before any interstate commerce was allowed. Fast forward to the late 1950s, when several expecting mothers in the UK and Japan were given thalidomide for morning sickness. We saw a lot of children born with severe birth defects. And this gave rise to reformers in Washington who used this to pass the Kefauver-Harris amendments to the FDA, Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act. And this required higher evidence standards of both safety and efficacy evidence for any new pharmaceutical to be approved for use. The only exemptions were for authorized programs called Investigational New Drug, or IND. And an IND exemption became the universal term here. It's not just for expanded access, even though it's used often in these conversations. IND is the name, whether it's clinical trial, single patient expanded access, or a group level expanded access. So many see the Kefauver-Harris amendments as the most impactful event in the history of drug regulation, but not necessarily in a positive way. While it might make sense to restrict access to food additives and cough medicine while waiting for proof of efficacy, sufferers of emergency and life-threatening situations faced a really different risk-reward prospect and had different appetites for uncertainty. So I include here a timetable that's central to the whole conversation. And this is kind of a generic development cycle for a new drug. It takes many years for clinical trials to bring a drug to market. And even after a reasonable amount of safety data is collected, it can still take years to prove efficacy at treating a disease. So next slide. FDA recognized this problem, responded to it with several specific exemptions, and these were all individually negotiated. We saw tropical and rare infectious diseases, NIH cancer drugs in expanded access, emergency IND. And these were really the first expanded access programs in the wake of the 1962 amendments. Not until the mid-1980s were the first guidelines in place, and they were turned into hard regulations in 1987, as you see on the right. This was an effort to streamline the process for access to what was then the antiretroviral drugs in the fight against AIDS. Incidentally, the term compassionate use was never part of this language. Compassionate use was first used by a journalist and has meant a lot of different things over the years to different people. So we don't use it, and I suggest that you don't use it either unless you want to confuse people. The types of expanded access at that point were treatment IND and emergency IND, with a continuation of NIH's Group C expanded access for cancer, plus a holdover called open label IND. Then we saw the concept of parallel track, which also began in the AIDS crisis, and this was to emphasize that expanded access was meant to be conducted in parallel with clinical trials before the drug's prospects for approval were clear, as opposed to later in the clinical development cycle after thousands might have died with no treatment options. About 100,000 AIDS patients participated in these programs in 8 different drugs, including Inverase and Crixivan, which are the first protease inhibitors. So I also mentioned quickly in 1990 and 97 there was rewrite of the device exemptions. We're not going to talk about devices on this call. And then in 2009 we have what are now the current regulations with 3 types of IND: individual, including emergency use INDs, intermediate size group, and large group, which is called a treatment IND or a treatment protocol. You'll see it sometimes referred to as a protocol and not a separate IND, because the sponsor, if they want, can simply amend the clinical trial IND to include access for additional patients. Next slide. Okay, these general requirements are going to look familiar to a lot of people on the call. Let's just go through them quickly. The drug has to be for a serious life-threatening or life-threatening disease. No satisfactory alternatives. Number 2 is really important. The likely benefit has to outweigh the additional hazard to the patient in consideration of the hazard of having the disease with no reasonable treatment alternative. And then third, also important, and we'll hear a lot about this, expanded access programs cannot interfere with continued clinical development. Next slide. So there are also additional requirements for each of the 3 types of IND that we looked at. The main difference is the nature of the request between the single patient here at the top, individual patient, which are usually filled out by the physician, as opposed to the 2 sizes of group INDs, which are negotiated in advance by the drug company and FDA. Next slide. So these requirements are easy to look up. You can just Google 21 CFR 312, and when you get to FDA's regulation page, just click on subpart I. It's pretty clear language. That's why you tend to see this, by the way, in every talk on expanded access. I just pulled out a few of the interesting differences. Individual patient INDs are really a one-off scenario. We're going to talk more about that. But what's key here is that FDA may ask the drug company to initiate a group IND if it's for more than a few patients. They don't want dozens of individual one-off scenarios. Intermediate and large, these are really small group and large group. On the intermediate size, it's interesting because you can go into a new indication than the indication where the clinical evidence has been accumulated. And you can begin an expanded access program with merely plausible pharmacological effect. That's usually early phase 2 trials. The treatment IND or treatment protocol, that's a larger of the 2 sizes. You've got to have data in the same indication to do a large size IND, and this requires more accumulated data. But they've introduced an easier standard for immediately life-threatening diseases, which ALS is, as opposed to merely serious diseases. And the definitions you can also look up. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, here are the steps involved for the physician and clinic, starting with the single patient IND. On the right, we have the itemized list of amendments that have to be sent to FDA. And I've heard FDA estimates about 10 to 15 hours to complete all the paperwork, but most agree that that's a very ambitious estimate. First, you have to contact the drug company, ask them to provide drug for what should be an exceptional situation, which, by the way, they probably will not offer, or sorry, yeah, probably won't honor it. Then, if you're successful, proceed to devise an individual protocol and a monitoring plan got to gain approval from your institutional review board and present a case history of the patient, the drug information, and rationale for use to FDA reviewers. There's also a matter of cost to treat and monitor the patient. It has to be worked out between the clinic, the patient, and the patient's payer system. Next. Contrast that with enrolling patients in a group expanded access program. This is a lot more like enrolling patients in a clinical trial. The trial sponsor works in advance with FDA to submit and approve the filing, so that takes a lot of the speculation out of the process. And the sponsor brings the protocol to each participating clinic along with fixed inclusion-exclusion criteria. Now this still takes resources, but it's a lot less overhead per patient. Next slide. Okay, let's look at the feasibility of the two expanded access scenarios from the perspective of patient and the patient's doctor. In a single patient case here, at the top, it's really not scalable. The work is not reproducible. It's unlikely to generate useful data. And also, it's not coming from a persuasive position when the letter of request is sent to the drug company. Contrast that with a group IND, where, as we said, the decision to accommodate patients has already been made by the company, and the details have been ironed out already with FDA and participating clinics. The process is transparent and reproducible, and the patient and clinic are contributing useful data. They can, at least, contribute useful data depending on the protocol. So next slide. I apologize for all the words, but I'll summarize. We just wanted to list some of the factors also from the drug company standpoint. For single patient programs, the arrangement has to include an ongoing supply and delivery of the drug product, and this can become problematic when the number of patients grows. We also have a fragmented and unreviewed amount of information circulating on social media and in the community, and this can create unrealistic expectations about a drug and also can create confusion about the company's policies. So remember, these are factors for the company to consider. There has to be an escalation chain for dealing with an individual patient's health issues and determining whether they're treatment-related health issues. And since it's hard to scale up the number of individually negotiated arrangements, there will be appearances of favoritism when demand for special access outstrips what the company is prepared for. On the other hand, down here at the bottom, group programs allow for uniform procedures of enrollment, dosing, monitoring, and reporting. Safety data collected from group programs can support authorization for further clinical studies. The protocol can include efficacy endpoints coordinated at several trial sites, and this can yield helpful information about what kinds of patients appear to respond best to the drug and help inform the design of later clinical trials. Most importantly, group programs can grow and they can continue in a more financially sustainable way. Let's go to the next slide. All right. Single patient INDs have a value. They definitely have their place in truly exceptional situations, but we should not be talking about them as feasible solutions for the thousands of patients who were excluded from research in diseases of high unmet medical need. This is a systemic issue, and single patient INDs were not meant for that. That's what group level parallel track expanded access is for. It's group level access under intermediate IND and treatment IND, and these are the ones we'll be talking about for the remainder of this session today. Let's go to the next slide. When a company chooses to make an unapproved drug available to broader groups of patients, why do it in an expanded access program? Why not in a regular clinical trial? Well, first of all, authorizing expanded access is entirely different than authorizing a research study. Remember, expanded access is primarily for treatment, and it's judged on that criteria based on the likely benefit, the net benefit to patients. So what this does is allows a company to include patients who might not necessarily be ideal subjects for research. They can be later stage, sicker patients. They can be patients with comorbidities, patients who've had the drug before, which constitutes an exclusion criteria in many research trials, or patients who've plateaued in their progression. Second, a lighter protocol can include fewer clinic visits and less rigorous measurement of endpoints than a registration trial or a clinical trial would. And there's usually no control arm, so you're not paying for blinding or randomization. So we have humanitarian intentions here of expanded access, and this can make it easier to partner with clinics and with advocacy groups than the traditional commercial work to bring a drug forward closer to approval. The last point here is cost recovery, and this is a really important distinction with expanded access. FDA recognizes that expanded access is a humanitarian exercise, not a for-profit exercise. They know it's voluntary for companies to pursue, and they see that many companies simply can't afford to do this on a meaningful scale on their own. It's not their job. So for expanded access programs, a sponsor is allowed to recover costs from third parties, and this can help make it self-sustaining. Most countries allow this. It's commonly done in a number of European countries, but less so in the U.S. because we have an uncertain system of private reimbursement and Medicare covering some things and not others, and the prevalence of healthcare hardships on families makes it a really tough thing in the past up till now on how exactly to fairly recover costs. So what we're left with is that companies just don't do expanded access if they cannot afford to shoulder 100% of the costs. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so what do we do with this expanded access mechanism? We've got some examples here of expanded access. The first one is what we saw during the AIDS crisis and what we saw in several large expanded access programs in cancer. These are parallel with registration trials, usually initiated after some degree of, after safety evidence is accumulated and some degree of efficacy. Then we have open label extensions. This is different for those patients who participated in the clinical trial. This gives them a single-arm extension afterward if they and their physician believe that the drug is of value. Third, in this top box here, pre-approval scenarios, early access, and this is after the completion of registration trials, and accumulated data makes it look imminent that the drug will be approved. Down below, there's other cases that fall into the expanded access category. You can have a bridge through marketing approval before the drug is commonly reimbursed. It's continued access for patients. Second, you can have post-first approval, but pre-approval in additional countries. Companies can offer the drug in an access program. And then post-first approval in additional groups or conditions. Let's go on. Next slide. All right. Do we see expanded access as often as would be medically warranted? And are they done early enough and large enough to address the human need? Next slide. So these are the basic facts. We've gone over most of them. 1962, market access changed, requiring IND filings to have any access to an investigational new drug. And then FDA recognized that this created a huge unmet need for the more serious and life-threatening diseases. They initiated special individually negotiated exemptions that were later promulgated into what we have as modern expanded access regulation. Third bullet, expanded access is for treatment, not primarily for research, although that doesn't stop an expanded access from engaging in research and having secondary objectives of learning from patients. Fourth, expanded access is regulated. It's ensuring safety, ethics, and definitely important, non-interference with the drug's progress toward approval. And I didn't say this earlier, but the group-level expanded access has a sponsor, and that's the entity that files the IND, and that can be the drug company or it can be a third party. There's no requirement in the U.S. to conduct expanded access. FDA reminds the company that its first job is to advance the drug toward timely market approval. And then we've seen a variety of ways expanded access can be used. Let's go to the next slide. So at this point, we're going to shift gears and look at some of the common and old narratives surrounding this topic. I've got a few statements here that generally have some degree of truth, but sadly they're used in ways that can cloud an intelligent discussion and often dismiss the whole prospect of expanded access. And my favorite is this one here in the red box. The interests of the patient must be balanced against the public need for focused clinical development and timely drug approval. So my translation here is that the implication is that access programs pose a real threat to good clinical research. And volumes of work have been written on how to balance these supposedly competing interests between the needs of the patient, with access needs, and good clinical research. And this writing discusses how, when push comes to shove, we should stay on the straight and narrow of good clinical research and not endanger it with early access. But it begs the question, how exactly does a well-designed access program interfere with research? The issue really comes from a scenario where a patient believes that there's value in trying a particular drug, and that patient can enroll in expanded access, then he'll do that and not enroll in a randomized clinical trial. That's the speculation. Why volunteer for a randomized clinical trial where there's a 50-50 chance of getting placebo or an ineffective drug for the next 6 months? And this is a legitimate concern for trial enrollment, but it's not an existential risk. It's a concern, and it's one that can be managed with standard best practices. You have to simply structure your enrollment criteria so that access programs and clinical trials are not competing with each other for enrollment. So, by the way, this also forces us to think about ways to make the prospect of placebo trials more appealing, and one way expanded access can help is in open label extensions for all participants. Awareness in advance of a post-study access program and inclusion criteria that admits only those patients who stay in the study can both boost enrollment and boost retention in the study. So let's look at an example. Perry, on the next slide. Here's the case of the antiretroviral drug didanosine targeting HIV. The expanded access program had over 20,000 patients worldwide, many of whom were in the same regions where phase 2 clinical trials were simultaneously being conducted, and those trials were still fully enrolled and retained patients in their trial. I highlighted here, actually I didn't highlight, I highlighted a key factor on the basic, but in blue you'll see the exclusion criteria. If you're eligible for registration trial, you're not eligible for expanded access. Another common criteria for exclusion is not admitting patients with a history of noncompliance in clinical trials. There are several other examples of very large expanded access programs accruing patients in parallel with enrollment in phase 2 and phase 3 trials. You have to dislocate the enrollment criteria. So we shouldn't generally regard expanded access as an existential risk to clinical trial enrollment. If you hear this claim in a conference or an essay, challenge it. Next slide. Okay, another narrative regards generalizable data. And again, this is generally a true statement. We don't expect to see, in general, broadly usable data outcomes in access programs. But that doesn't mean that programs cannot provide data that helps the drug advance. That's really the key reminder here. This is really a function of protocol design. A single-arm study can certainly be constructed with measurable outcomes. And let's go to the next slide for an example. This is ERESA, an early tyrosine kinase inhibitor used in lung cancer patients who could not tolerate chemotherapy. And the worldwide access program enrolled over 24,000 patients, which helped to confirm the safety and efficacy findings of the clinical trials. It found that women and East Asians appeared to respond better to the drug compared to their counterparts. It also showed that an adverse event found in one of the clinical trials was not a hazard in the general disease population. And years later, data from the program revealed that EGFR mutation positive patients also outperformed. So we can actually learn from these patients who were given a chance to be in clinical programs. Next slide. I'm going to go quickly. This is Gleevec. Expanded access here included over 7,000 leukemia patients. This was designed with a uniform protocol to collect useful endpoint data, including tumor size, time to progression, and overall survival. In addition, of course, it tracked long-term safety. Also on this page, notice the blue exclusion criteria, and this was only for patients who could no longer enroll in registration trials and did not have a history of dropping out of past trials. So on this page we see both best practices for non-interference with clinical research and actively contributing to that research. Next slide. So this is a curious one. Expanded access requires drug company has available inventories. It's kind of like saying to drive yourself to work in the morning, you got to have a car. And we might scratch our heads, but sometimes it's implied to suggest that it's simply not feasible to do a program unless the company happens to have spare drug lying around. Well, we just looked at 3 large examples of programs where new supplies were manufactured specifically for expanded access. Nothing stops a drug company or a third party from commissioning a resupply from its supply chain. So let's go to the next slide. Best way to meet patients' needs is to focus on swift approval of new effective drugs. We have to respect this. It comes from language in the FDA. They say it all the time, and it's often repeated. It's a reminder not to do anything that distracts from clinical development. Generally agreeable, but we have to define which patients' needs we're talking about. What's the best way to meet these patients' needs? Let's go to the next slide. 8.5. I think this number sheds light on the issue. I'm borrowing here from my new hero, Linda House, from Cancer Support Community, who presented last month at a pharma workshop on this topic. And when this number flashed up on the screen, there was groans from the audience. Let's go to the next slide. And that's because 8.5 years is the average time to actually bring a drug through to approval, and that's if the drug is actually broadly approvable in your disease. This number is clearly in excess of the remaining lifespan of current patients in ALS and many other diseases. So we need to respect patients who want to beat their disease and who don't have time to wait for drug approvals. It's not a matter of whether they look for treatment options, but a matter of what options we make available to them. Next slide. Okay, where does that leave us? Right now we have group-level expanded access. It's a well-regulated channel for allowing patients and the physicians to look at new medical options that they otherwise wouldn't have access to. When done right, they don't disrupt clinical research. You can have coordinated studies with a protocol. The regulations are accommodative, and I can tell you that the review division is also very receptive to group-level expanded access in ALS. So what's left to tackle? Down at the bottom, we've got the management burdens and the economics faced by the drug company as well as the clinics, and how do we effectively scale this up so that we address a meaningful size of the patient population. Next slide. This is a survey of pharma execs on the topic of expanded access. This just backs up some of the other slides, and so in the interest of time, I think we're going to skip this. Let's go to the next slide. Briefly, really quick here at the end, I just want to talk about a new path forward in ALS. How can we make these parallel track expanded access programs more feasible in diseases like ALS? And I've got a note on this. You'll give me a moment here. Okay. 3 things. Financial cost, the operational headache, go back, the operational and management issues, and supporting clinical development. So the question is, what if these burdens could be lifted from the drug company by a third party and leave that company free to focus on its job, which is bringing its product closer to marketing approval? And what if along the way we can add something that's critically important to ALS development and disease research, which is more human data? Okay, now go to the next. So we have a nonprofit platform to focus on the financial cost. We probably don't have time to get into the details of it, and also handles the regulatory work, the commissioning of service providers, and working directly with the clinics in the disease that it knows well, with medical advisors also in that disease. This third party sponsors and files the treatment IND for centrally coordinated expanded access programs with safety monitoring and a protocol. And third, can support clinical development through new data that these programs create. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, again, this platform actually already exists. It's called ALS Emergency Treatment Fund. We founded it in 2012 with the support of patients and patient advocacy. It was created really to work in partnership with the drug companies, as I mentioned, along with leading disease foundations and clinics who are interested in providing their patients with more options. We have a volunteer staff of life science professionals, including trial managers with dozens of years in expanded access programs experience. So that's important, and we also have solid relationship with the review division at FDA on this topic. And then third is the Learning from Patients Science Initiative. It's a separately funded collaboration, hopefully able to create outcomes that can support biomarker discovery and lead to additional research in ALS. Next slide. So this results in an expanded access trial of the study drug. This comes back to the case example that we began with. This would be conducted at participating clinics. There would be a cost-sharing structure, probably beyond the scope of today's call, but this is done in a collaborative way with FDA involvement. That's much better than the alternative, in my opinion, and it can include patient assistance funding and hopefully improved reimbursement laws in the future. also consent for research, as I mentioned. So let's go to the next slide. This is my last one. There are several investigational products in ALS that right now meet the authorization criteria for large-scale expanded access in parallel to ongoing registration studies. We don't have to wait. ALS Emergency Treatment Fund is right now positioned to file a treatment IND and manage the scalable expanded access in the U.S. for one or more of these products at minimal or no cost to the drug company or participating clinics. So I've got a graph here, kind of shows the concept. We're merging treatment options with clinical research, and you can do that when you re-engage all these patients who no longer have access to traditional clinical trials that would be interested in exploring new investigational medicine and would be happy to contribute to research. So Rick, I'll turn it back to you.
Well, thank you very much, Jess. I learned a lot today from you, and if we take this back into the clinic to our hypothetical example, it seems clear that the most feasible option would be for the patient and I to pursue an existing group IND, and ideally one that was created by ALS-ETF. And the reasons that I heard today, you would negotiate with the drug company to help us get the product at the best possible price. You'd be consulting with an advisory board so that I know we'd have a rational protocol that optimizes safety, efficiency, transparency, and reproducibility. You'd help us with the lengthy FDA as well as institutional paperwork. And finally, you'd build in a nice research study so we'd optimize what we can learn from this patient's experience. So I think we'll open it up for questions now.
All right, thanks, Jess and Dr. Bedlack. So we do have a little over 10 minutes here for questions, and we do already have some that came in during the presentation, so let me just pull those up and we can get going. Just the first one, I believe this happened at the very beginning of the presentation, but could you please define IND for the audience?
IND stands for Investigational New Drug. Great question, because it's often used, and I've seen it used in shorthand in a lot of news articles for an expanded access program. And I know how this happens because a lot of people are aware of single patient IND. But the key here is that IND is the broad category of exemptions to the Food and Drug Act's restriction from using unapproved drugs. And it includes clinical trials. Yes, it includes single patient IND, but also any expanded access program. So any program we're talking about is an investigational new drug filing called IND.
Okay. Next question we have is riluzole considered a satisfactory alternative treatment, thereby making expanded access to other investigational drugs impossible or very difficult?
I have an opinion on that, but I think I would defer to Dr. Bedlack on the medical issue.
I would say the answer to that is no. I mean, it's the best we have, but clearly it has only a very small effect, and ALS remains a rapidly disabling, fatal disease. So I think the FDA would clearly understand, even with riluzole on the market, the need for expanded access in this disease.
Okay, thank you. Are specifics of expanded access INDs a matter of public record anywhere?
No, they're not. There is the resource called clinicaltrials.gov, and where registration trials are required to be, in my understanding, required to be listed on clinicaltrials.gov. Humanitarian exercises in expanded access are not required to be listed there, although many still are. And to my knowledge, there's no repository of either the history of expanded access programs or currently available ones. However, that's something that I would like to be involved in as a project, and it's something I've done a considerable amount of work in digging up with past programs. And I'd be happy to share that if anybody wants to follow up.
If more than 100 patients are treated under an expanded access program, will the FDA shut the program down since it indicates that patients or companies are trying to get around the Food and Drug Act?
So I think the answer to what the person is asking is no, based on the number, because certainly there are much larger, if I understand right, 100 is not considered the upper bound of an expanded access program. Remember, you've got individual single patient INDs for exceptions, really unusual cases like the boy who was treated with the Chimerix drug, who had this rare adenovirus infection. But then you have group-level expanded access for really tough diseases like AIDS or Alzheimer's or ALS, where you've got thousands of patients who are looking for access, and the history includes thousands of patients in those programs. But there was a good point there about the risk of companies trying to get around the normal regulatory framework. I would say that the way FDA reduces that conflict of interest is by prohibiting any profit from occurring before a drug is approved for marketing. So I mentioned cost recovery. You can recover basic costs, but even then it's really not financially feasible to do these programs. That's one reason why you don't see them, at least in the United States. And that's really because FDA doesn't want to create a incentive for companies to just sell the drug through expanded access. You can't do it. You can only recover at costs. But as far as the number, they can be very large.
Okay. Unlike AIDS and many cancers, ALS is a rare disease, and most drug companies do not see this as a very profitable area for their future. It seems like this would make a very big difference regarding EAPs for ALS. Do you agree?
Well, thanks for that comment. I certainly agree. That's a big part of the prospect I've presented to companies. I might not agree with the premise that ALS is so rare that it doesn't constitute a market opportunity. I go to the pharma conferences every year, and rare diseases are really the new frontier of private equity and public investment. You've got blockbuster diseases that are saturated with 13, 14 cholesterol drugs. And what Big Pharma is looking for is a drug that has shown proof of concept and might be able to make a difference in one of these terrible diseases like ALS. Remember, there's still tens of thousands of patients with this disease in the U.S. alone. So that's a pretty substantial market. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't answer the question. And as far as expanded access, yes, this is something that can help a company gain human data in addition to doing its job of small, well-defined registration trials. We on the side can address the needs of the thousands of patients who don't qualify for registration trials. And it's certainly a win-win partnership with the drug company.
Okay, so we had a few people ask a similar question. How do we go forward to find out about how we can get info on expanded access? Who do we contact?
Well, the best point of contact usually is the physician at the clinic. So I would advise every patient who's interested in expanded access to ask your doctor what they know about expanded access. If they are interested in making investigational stage drugs available to patients who may not qualify or may not, for geographic reasons or other reasons, may not have access to clinical trials. And that basically it lights a little fire under the feet of people who may not be aware or may not be inclined to look into this opportunity. In addition, I'm happy to consult with any clinic, and I really enjoy talking to families and patients about this as well.
Okay, and another general question that a few have asked is expanded access only for drugs? What about something like Brainstorm's neurone stem cell process?
Aha, well, that's a great question. There's a spectrum. It's certainly easier in scenarios where a drug can be mass-produced at scale. Small molecule pharmaceuticals, you're really looking at the cost of the pill. And by the way, the costs in drug development are really in research and development, not so much in manufacturing these things. When you deal with a treatment or surgery, it's much different because you're paying for OR time, rent at the hospital, the surgeon's time. It's a very costly process of cultivating the cells. So I'm sorry, I don't have a great answer as far as expanded access in stem cell or procedural-based treatments, but hey, I'm happy to learn, and I think this is it's a growing topic, and some therapeutics are trickier than others, and unfortunately, stem cells is a bit tricky right now.
How can patients help ALS-ETF promote this idea of EAP with the few pharmaceutical companies in the ALS space?
Talk about it. The best is to make people aware of this opportunity. I think the logic is there. The facts and the regulations speak for themselves. There's a lot of traditional beliefs in this area, and I think we heard some things today that challenge those beliefs. We just need to open the conversation. So by all means, we would really benefit from an arm of advocacy in patients who say that they want this kind of thing. ALS-ETF is not patient advocacy. I set out with my colleagues to be an operating company and to provide the solution, and the more people in the patient community asking for it, telling foundations like ALS Association, telling drug companies and talking to their clinics about it, the better.
Okay. It looks like we have time for a couple more questions here. So have any group of ALS patients contacted the ALS-ETF regarding interest in a specific EAP?
No. Yeah, so ALS Emergency Treatment Fund began as a spin-off of a really exciting advocacy effort called ALS Treat Us Now. And I personally was involved in that. Eric Valor, Tom Murphy, Ted Harada, really great people were involved. We were interested in regulatory innovation and getting the most out of the regulations that exist right now. This current venture, ETF, is the latter. It's getting the most out of existing regulations. I'd love, unfortunately, Treat Us Now is no longer an organization, but any other advocacy work to support this would really be helpful.
Great, thank you. So actually it looks like that's all the time we do have for today. So thank you everybody for joining us on this webinar. And Jess and Dr. Bedlock, do you have any closing statements that you'd like to make?
No, I learned a lot today. That's all I'll say. Thank you very much, Jess.
Thank you, Rick. I really appreciate your time, and thanks everybody for being on this call. I'm really excited about this opportunity, and I'm happy to talk further if anybody wants to contact me afterward.
Great. Well, thank you again both so much for coming on the call today, and everyone have a great rest of the day.